On November 12, 1996, two passenger jets collided in the skies near New Delhi, India, killing all 349 passengers and crew on board both planes. It is the world's deadliest mid-air collision. Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763 was a Boeing 747 departing from Indira Gandhi International Airport in Delhi. The flight was bound for Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, with 312 people on board, including an estimated 200 Indian nationals that worked in the kingdom. The other plane involved was Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, a former Soviet cargo plane modified for passenger transport. The plane was en route to Delhi from Kazakhstan. For the airlines of the former Soviet Union, the 1990s were an extremely difficult period, marked by financial insolvency, poor management, and operational issues. The Central Asian nation of Kazakhstan was no different. At the time of the incident, the state-owned Kazakhstan Airlines was almost bankrupt, just 5 years after independence. Things were so bad that the airline was due to be shut down just days before the collision. One way in which several post-Soviet airlines would make money was to offer flights known as merchant charters. Merchants would use these flights to travel on mostly empty planes, purchase goods from abroad, and resell them back home. The majority of passengers on this flight were merchants from the former Soviet Republic of Kyrgyzstan. In 1996, Indian airspace was a confused mess, with no structure for handling civilian and military airspace. Civilian flights were banned from military airspace and vice versa. The two sets of air traffic controllers did not talk to each other and handled only their own aircraft. Up until the previous year, Indira Gandhi International Airport had been run by the Indian Air Force. There were 4 separate traffic corridors in and out of the airport, but only one was designated for civilian planes. At 6:33 p.m. local time, Kazakhstan 1907 received clearance to descend to 18,000 feet. At the same time, Saudi Airlines Flight 763 lifted off from Indira Gandhi and received clearance to climb to 10,000 feet, along the same civilian corridor used by the Kazakh flight. It was standard procedure for the air traffic controllers to keep the departures underneath the arrivals. At 6:35, radio operator Igor Rep aboard the Kazakh flight contacted air traffic control and was cleared to descend to 15,000 feet. The navigator on board the plane stated that 15,000 feet was equal to 4,500 meters. Like all Soviet-built aircraft, the plane was originally fit with instruments in metric, including altimeters measuring meters, not feet. To make matters more confusing, the plane was fitted with just 2 altimeters, one for the captain and one for the navigator. The first officer, who was actually flying the plane, and the radio operator, the only crew member talking to the air traffic control, had none. Air traffic control then cleared Saudi 763 to climb to 14,000 feet. The Kazakh plane now traveled at 15,000 feet, allowing the standard minimum 1,000 feet separation mandated by international regulations. Although having reported reaching 15,000 feet, the Kazakhstan Airlines flight was almost 1,500 feet higher. It's unclear why. It's possible the radio operator was simply guessing their altitude. He did not have an altimeter and would have had to reach uncomfortably in the cockpit to read either the captain's or engineer's altimeter. He may not have understood the difference between reached and approaching. Either way, the controller instructed him to maintain 15,000 feet. Rep took a long time to reply, during which time the captain and first officer could be heard discussing the traffic in the background. Kazakh Flight 1907 finally reached 15,000 feet, but somehow kept descending. Saudi Flight 763 was traveling just 1,000 feet below, and getting closer by the second. For nearly 30 seconds, the plane kept descending, then entered a large cloud. Suddenly, at 6:40, someone in the Kazakh cockpit, presumably Rep, called out, "Hold the level!" He must have finally got a good look at the altimeter and could see they were too low. The captain sounded confused and asked what flight level they were given. Rep then yelled out, "Keep to level 150, 15,000 feet, don't descend." The captain disconnected the autopilot, ordered the flight engineer to increase engine power in an attempt to climb, but it was too late. The cockpit voice recorder captured Rep shouting, "Get to 150, because on the 140, that one." In that moment, he must have caught a glimpse of the Saudi jet emerging from the cloud on a collision course. There was no time to react. The two planes collided head-on. The Boeing's two left engines collided with the left wing of the ex-Soviet transport plane, followed by another collision as the 747's left horizontal stabilizer severed the tail of the Kazakh plane. Both planes then entered a dive from which they could not escape. Flying at 20,000 feet, a US Air Force pilot saw a cloud light up in flickering orange, then two flaming objects emerged, falling in long descending arcs towards the ground. The crash site was in the countryside near Charki Dadri, 75 kilometers west of Indira Gandhi International Airport. Emergency services discovered fiery wreckage strewn over an area 7 kilometers in length. The disaster further undermined the confidence in India's already poor aviation safety record. Indian, Kazakh, and Saudi officials took turns blaming the others for the disaster. Just how bad was India's aviation infrastructure, or the Kazakh flight crew's English? The task to find out fell to a specially appointed board of inquiry. The most important question was which plane was not where it was supposed to be. The air traffic controller was not to blame, as he had instructed the planes to maintain a distance of 1,000 feet as per standard procedures. The data from the flight data recorders was analysed. It determined that the collision occurred at 14,000 feet, but there was no evidence that the Saudi jet had strayed from its assigned altitude. So why had the Kazakh plane not stayed at 15,000 feet? Representatives of Kazakhstan Airlines suggested that the plane had hit turbulence, as the flight data recorder had not shown a continuous descent, but rather two drops after periods of level flight. This argument was, however, dismissed as nonsense. There were no reported storms or turbulence in the area of the disaster. According to experts in Moscow that had analysed the Kazakh plane's data, the data said that the abrupt descents were the result of a sticky sensor, which continued to show the same altitude continually before suddenly updating. The Board of Inquiry then turned their attention once again to the air traffic control system. Although the controller had given clear instructions to both planes, he had no way of confirming that they had been carried out. There was no secondary radar at Indira Gandhi. The primary radar in use simply bounces a radio wave off an object to determine its location and direction. Secondary radar also displays a flight number and altitude. Plans had been underway for the last 10 years to update the radar, but it never happened. In the end, although the Board of Inquiry made substantial recommendations which led to improvements in air safety in India, the report could not say for sure exactly why the Kazakhstan plane kept descending. On August 28, 1988, around 300,000 fans gathered at the Ramstein US Air Force Base in West Germany to watch an airshow featuring the Italian Air Force. During the performance, however, a mid-air collision resulted in what was, at the time, the deadliest airshow disaster in history. With the onset of the Cold War, growing tensions with the Soviet Union forced the United States to move their air presence away from East Germany. As part of the NATO expansion plan, France agreed to provide Air Force base sites in their zone of occupation in Rhineland-Palatinate. Construction began on the Ramstein Air Force Base near Kaiserslautern in 1949, and it opened on June 1, 1953. Created in 1961, the Italian Air Force's aerobatic demonstration team, the Frecce Tricolori, or Tricolor Arrows, consisted of 10 pilots. While only the best pilots were considered for membership, the team got off to a rocky start, suffering 4 accidents in their first year. One of the highlights of their performance was the pierced heart maneuver, where 2 groups of planes would fly in opposite directions to form a heart. Another aircraft would then pierce the heart. During the afternoon of August 28, 1988, the Frecce Tricolori performed this stunt at the end of the airshow. As planned, the 2 heart-forming groups passed each other. However, the heart-piercing aircraft, known as Pony 10, came in too low and too fast. It collided with the lead plane, Pony 1, destroying its tail section. Pony 1 then spiraled out of control, colliding with another plane, Pony 2. Pony 1's pilot ejected, but was killed as he hit the runway before his parachute could open. His plane then collided with the medevac helicopter situated on a nearby taxiway, killing its pilot. Pony 2 then crashed beside the runway, exploding into a fireball, killing its pilot on impact. The plane that caused the accident, Pony 10, continued across the runway in flames towards the spectators and crashed into the grandstand. Less than 7 seconds elapsed between the time of the initial impact and the collision with the grandstand, leaving spectators little time to escape. The disaster revealed serious shortcomings in the handling of large-scale emergency procedures by both German civil and American military authorities. US military personnel did not immediately allow German ambulances onto the base, as a necessary permission had to be granted. To make matters worse, it wasn't until an hour after the accident that enough ambulances had arrived to treat the injured. While American helicopters and ambulances provided the quickest means of evacuating burn victims, they lacked sufficient capacities for treating them while in transit to hospital. One paramedic at the scene stated, "At the time we arrived shortly after 5 o'clock, there were no injured people, no more. We could see that the last badly injured people were loaded into American helicopters. We could see some pickup trucks with injured people transporting them away. It was not possible to find an officer in charge, a director of operations, or even a contact person. So we got to the hospital by our own initiative. Asking several action forces, paramedics, police officers, nobody could name a director of operations. I was asking for a managing paramedic of the operation to coordinate the evacuation, but there was none." In the aftermath of the disaster, an investigation was undertaken to determine the cause. Video footage from spectators showed that Pony 10, the piercing aircraft, had come in too low and too fast, but could not determine why. The collision was attributed to pilot error. In all, 3 pilots and 67 spectators were killed in the disaster. 2 memorials were erected in honor of the victims. One open to the public outside the base, and another inside the base itself. On the morning of September 25, 1978, Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 182 collided with a private Cessna light aircraft over San Diego, California. All 137 passengers and crew aboard both planes, and a further 7 people on the ground lost their lives in the accident. It is the deadliest air disaster in California history. Flight 182, a Boeing 727, was en route from Los Angeles International Airport. At 8:59 a.m., air traffic control alerted the PSA crew to a nearby Cessna 172 Skyhawk aircraft. The pilot of the Cessna was pursuing his instrument rating certification. Due to this, he wore a hood that restricted his peripheral vision, which is normal in instrument flight training. Air traffic control advised the PSA crew that the Cessna, flying northeast, was at a distance of 1 mile. The crew reported seeing the Cessna, then reported that they had lost visual contact. After receiving permission to land, and about 40 seconds prior to the collision, the PSA flight crew continued to act confused regarding the Cessna's whereabouts. Despite the captain's comment that the Cessna was probably behind us, it was, in fact, directly in front of and below Flight 182. The PSA flight was descending and rapidly closing in on the Cessna, which had now deviated from its assigned course. According to the report issued by the National Transportation Safety Board, the PSA pilots may have had difficulty seeing the Cessna, as its colors blended in with the roofs on the houses in the neighborhood below. For some reason, Flight 182's crew never officially alerted the tower that they had lost sight of the Cessna. If they had, the collision might not have occurred. Also, if the Cessna had not deviated from its air traffic control assigned bearing of 70 degrees, instead of turning to 90 degrees, the collision may have been avoided. The NTSB estimated that the planes would have missed each other by about 1,000 feet, 300 meters, instead of colliding. Regardless, the report stated that it was the responsibility of the Boeing jet to comply with the requirement to pass well clear of the Cessna. The PSA plane overtook the Cessna, which was now directly below it, both roughly on a 90-degree due east heading. The collision occurred at about 2,700 feet, or 790 meters. According to several witnesses on the ground, first they heard a loud metallic crunching sound, then an explosion. Staff photographer Hans Wendt of the San Diego County Public Relations Office was attending an outdoor press event on the morning of the accident, and took 2 photographs of the falling 727, its right wing on fire. Flight 182's right wing was heavily damaged and on fire due to its ruptured fuel tank. This rendered the plane uncontrollable and sent it into a sharp right-hand bank. As the plane fell out of the sky, the following conversation could be heard in the cockpit. Flight 182 struck a house at 3611 Niles Street, 3 miles, 5 kilometers northeast of San Diego's Lindbergh Field Airport, in a North Park residential neighborhood. It then impacted the driveway at 300 miles an hour, 480 kilometers an hour, nose down, while banked 50 degrees to the right. One of the plane's wings lodged in a nearby house. The crash of Flight 182 created a mushroom cloud that could be seen for miles. The severity of the impact meant that the plane's engines, tail section, and landing gear were among the few recognizable parts remaining. However, the impact and debris area was relatively small, due to the plane's steep nose-down angle. At the time, it was the deadliest aircraft accident in the United States, until 8 months later when American Airlines Flight 191 crashed with a loss of 273 lives. The National Transportation Safety Board report determined that the probable cause of the collision was the failure of the PSA flight's crew to follow proper air traffic control procedures. Its crew lost sight of the Cessna despite instructions to keep visual separation from that traffic, and did not alert the tower that they could no longer see the aircraft. As a result of this and other mid-air collisions, the Traffic Collision Alert and Avoidance System, or TCAS, is now installed on all commercial passenger aircraft. This system gives pilots an audible warning of approaching traffic and directs pilots to either ascend or descend to prevent a collision. A memorial plaque honoring those who died in the disaster is located in the San Diego Airspace Museum.